It was a stormy night in rural Kansas when Jake decided to call his girlfriend, Emily. The power had been out for hours, and the only source of light was the relentless flashes of lightning outside. Jake's old rotary phone was his only means of communication. As cell service in the area was notoriously unreliable during storms, he dialed Emily's number. The storm intensified, and the howling wind made the walls of his small farmhouse groan. The phone rang once, twice, and then she picked up. "Hello?" Emily's voice was faint, almost distorted. "Hey, it's me. Are you okay?" "The storm is crazy out here," Jake said, gripping the receiver tightly. There was a pause before Emily replied, her voice shaky. "Jake, why are you calling me from my house?" Jake froze, his blood turning to ice. "What are you talking about?" "I'm at my place." "No, you're not," Emily whispered. "The phone says the call is coming from my landline. I can see the cord hanging by the kitchen wall." Before Jake could respond, he heard a faint noise in the background on her end. A slow, deliberate tapping sound, like fingers on a window pane. "Emily, don't hang up," Jake said, his voice trembling. "Get out of there. Now!" The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then Emily gasped. "There's someone outside the window. He's staring at me." Jake shouted her name, but the line went dead. The storm raged on as Jake grabbed his truck keys, praying he could make it to Emily's house before it was too late. Jake's truck roared to life as he sped down the dirt road toward Emily's house. The storm seemed angrier now, lightning splitting the sky in rapid flashes, illuminating the barren fields around him. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Emily's house was only 10 minutes away, but every second felt like an eternity. His mind raced, replaying her terrified voice and that eerie tapping sound. Who or what could be inside her house? When he finally reached her driveway, Jake noticed something odd. Her porch light was on, flickering weakly in the rain, but her car was nowhere to be seen. Emily never left home during storms. She was terrified of driving in bad weather. He parked his truck and sprinted toward the house, the rain soaking him to the bone. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pushed it open and shut. Jake hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. "Emily," he called, his voice echoing through the darkened house. There was no response. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, the phone ripped from the wall, its cord dangling like a severed limb. Jake's heart pounded as he moved cautiously toward the kitchen, where he had last heard her on the phone. "Emily," he called again, his voice trembling. Lightning illuminated the room for a brief moment, and Jake froze. In that fleeting flash, he saw something or someone standing by the kitchen window. It was a tall, shadowy figure with unnaturally long limbs, its face obscured by darkness. "Who's there?" Jake demanded, grabbing a kitchen knife from the counter. The figure didn't move. Another flash of lightning lit up the room, and Jake realized with a sinking feeling that the figure wasn't outside. It was inside, standing inches away from the window. Jake backed away slowly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him, and then it spoke in a voice that was both familiar and utterly alien. "She's gone, Jake. But she's waiting for you." The room plunged back into darkness as the lightning faded. Jake lunged forward with the knife, but his hands met empty air. The figure was gone. A loud crash came from upstairs. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't leave without Emily. Tightening his grip on the knife, he ascended the creaking staircase, each step taking him closer to the source of the noise. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him, lit sporadically by the storm outside. Every door was closed except for one. Emily's bedroom. The door swung open as Jake approached, revealing a scene that made his blood run cold. Emily's bed was empty, but the walls were covered in deep, claw-like scratches. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the storm. And on the floor, in the center of the room, was Emily's phone. Jake picked it up with shaking hands, the screen flickering to life. There was one new voicemail. With a trembling finger, he pressed play. "Jake," Emily's voice whispered, faint and distorted. I'm not alone. Please." Her voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Then the message ended with a chilling final sound. A tap, tap, tap against the glass. Jake turned toward the open window, his heart hammering in his chest. Something was outside, watching him, and then he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Jake felt the weight of the storm pressing against the house, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating fear that gripped his chest. The tapping at the window continued, slow and deliberate, as if daring him to look. Gathering every ounce of courage he had, Jake approached the open window. The rain lashed against his face as he leaned out, the wind howling around him. At first, he saw nothing, just the swaying trees and the shadowy outline of Emily's backyard. But then a flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. There she was, Emily. She stood motionless at the edge of the yard, her white nightgown plastered to her body by the rain. Her head hung low, her long, wet hair obscuring her face. "Emily!" Jake shouted, his voice breaking. "Are you okay? What happened?" She didn't respond. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed toward the forest behind the house. Jake squinted, trying to see what she was pointing at, but the storm made it impossible. "Emily, come inside," he pleaded. She didn't move. Another flash of lightning revealed something horrifying. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering several inches above the muddy grass, her body unnaturally still. Jake staggered back, his mind reeling. "Emily?" Then, without warning, she tilted her head up. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and black, like endless voids. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, the tapping noise returned, louder and faster, though she stood completely still. Panicking, Jake slammed the window shut and backed away. The tapping didn't stop. It was inside the room now, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Jake clutched his head, trying to block out the sound, but it grew louder and louder until it felt like it would split his skull. Then everything went silent, utterly silent. Jake looked up. The storm had stopped, and the room was eerily still. He turned toward the window, but it was no longer open. Instead, it was sealed tightly, the rain and wind gone. Confused, he stumbled into the hallway, calling out for Emily. The house was perfectly intact. No overturned furniture, no scratches on the walls. It was as if nothing had happened. But as Jake reached the front door, he froze. His truck was gone. The driveway was empty, the ground dry as if the storm had never happened. And on the floor, just inside the door, was Emily's phone. Jake picked it up with trembling hands. The screen flickered to life, showing one new voicemail. With a sinking feeling, he pressed play. "Jake," Emily's voice whispered, her tone calm and deliberate. "You shouldn't have come. You brought it with you." Suddenly, the tapping began again, louder this time, coming from behind him. Slowly, Jake turned around. Standing in the shadows of the hallway was the figure he'd seen earlier, its impossibly long limbs stretching toward him. Its face was now visible, a twisted, hollow mockery of Emily's features. The last thing Jake saw before everything went black was the figure lunging at him, its mouth opening wide, emitting a soundless scream. When the townspeople found Jake's house the next morning, they discovered the door wide open and the phone lying on the floor. There was no sign of Jake or Emily, but the only thing left inside was a message scratched into the wall near the window. It follows. On a remote highway cutting through the Appalachian Mountains, Mia drove nervously through the relentless downpour. The storm had rolled in faster than expected, and visibility was almost non-existent. The radio crackled with static, the only company she had in the oppressive silence. As she rounded a curve, her headlights illuminated a figure standing on the roadside. A man, soaked to the bone, his face obscured by the hood of his raincoat. He held up a hand, signaling for a ride. Against her better judgment, Mia pulled over. She rolled down the window slightly. "You need help?" she called out, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. The man nodded but didn't speak. Something about him unsettled her, but she couldn't just leave him stranded in the storm. Reluctantly, she unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in without a word, dripping water all over the seat. Mia noticed his hands were pale, almost corpse-like, and his nails were unnaturally long. "Where are you headed?" she asked, forcing a casual tone. "Just up the road," the man replied, his voice low and raspy. As they drove in tense silence, Mia felt a strange chill creeping into the car. She glanced at the man out of the corner of her eye. His hood had fallen back slightly, revealing a gaunt, hollow face with eyes that gleamed like wet stones. "You're going too fast," he said suddenly, his tone sharp. "I'm barely going 30, Mia retorted, glancing at the speedometer. "Too fast," he repeated, his voice growing more menacing. The car lurched violently as a massive tree branch crashed onto the road ahead. Mia slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding. When she turned to thank the man for the warning, the passenger seat was empty, and the door was still locked. Mia sat frozen in her seat, staring at the empty passenger side. The storm outside intensified, the rain hammering against the windshield. Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The man had been there. She had seen him, heard him, and now he was gone, leaving no trace. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, filling the car with a distorted voice. "You should have kept driving, Mia." Her blood ran cold. She slammed her hand against the radio, trying to shut it off, but it wouldn't stop. The voice continued, growing clearer. "You didn't listen. You picked me up, and now, you can't leave." The headlights flickered, plunging the road into darkness. Mia's hands gripped the steering wheel as panic set in. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. "It's just the storm. Just my imagination." The car jolted violently, as if something heavy had landed on the roof. The impact nearly sent her skidding off the road. "What the hell?" she screamed, glancing up. A series of loud thuds followed, echoing through the car as if someone, or something, was crawling across the roof. Mia slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the relentless pounding of the rain. She sat there, paralyzed with fear, until a new sound reached her ears. A slow, deliberate tapping on the driver's side window. Trembling, Mia turned her head. The hitchhiker was there, his face pressed against the glass. But it wasn't the same man she had picked up. His features were twisted, his skin unnaturally pale and cracked, like dried clay. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and his mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. "Going somewhere?" he rasped, his voice echoing inside her head. Mia screamed and floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. The figure disappeared from the window, but she could hear him laughing, the sound following her no matter how fast she drove. The road seemed endless now, stretching on into the storm with no signs or landmarks. The trees on either side swayed violently in the wind, their branches clawing at the car. And then, up ahead, her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was him, the hitchhiker. Mia slammed the brakes again, but it was too late. The car plowed into the figure with a sickening thud. She skidded to a stop, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped out of the car, her knees buckling beneath her. The storm whipped around her, but she barely noticed. The road was empty. There was no body, no sign of the hitchhiker. Her relief was short-lived. She turned back toward the car and froze. He was sitting in the driver's seat, his head tilted to the side. That same unnatural grin stretched across his face. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice dripping with malice. The last thing Mia saw was his hand reaching out for her as the storm swallowed her scream. The next morning, Highway Patrol found her car abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's seat was soaked, as if someone had been sitting there drenched in water. But there was no sign of Mia. Locals whispered about the hitchhiker, an apparition that appeared during storms, luring kind-hearted travelers to their doom. And every time a storm rolled in, they'd warn each other, "Don't stop. No matter what you see, don't stop." In the small town of Cedar Grove, the old storm shelter behind the elementary school was rumored to be haunted. Locals whispered about the strange noises that came from it during thunderstorms, but no one dared to investigate. One night, during a particularly violent storm, a group of teenagers dared each other to spend the night in the shelter. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they descended the rusted metal stairs into the damp, claustrophobic space. The storm outside was deafening, but it only added to the thrill of their adventure. They laughed and joked, their voices echoing off the concrete walls. Then the first scream pierced the air. It came from deeper within the shelter, a high-pitched wail that sent shivers down their spines. The group fell silent, exchanging nervous glances. "Probably just the wind," one of them muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. As they ventured further, their flashlights flickered and dimmed. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around them. And then they saw it, shadowy figures moving just beyond the beam of light. They were human-shaped but distorted, their limbs too long and their movements jerky, like marionettes controlled by unseen hands. One of the teens bolted for the stairs, but the door slammed shut with a deafening clang. The storm raged on above them as the shelter's true inhabitants closed in. The teenagers huddled together in the center of the shelter, their flashlights flickering wildly as the shadows closed in around them. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the tapping sound, like nails on concrete, echoed louder with every second. "Who's there?" Ryan, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, shouted, his voice trembling despite his bravado. The tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, a voice answered, low and raspy, as if it came from deep within the walls. "You shouldn't have come here. This place isn't yours." The words sent a chill through the group, and Emily, the youngest, began to sob. "I want to leave," she cried, clutching Ryan's arm. "We're leaving now," Ryan said, trying to sound confident. He grabbed Emily's hand and motioned for the others to follow. But as they turned toward the stairs, they saw it. The door at the top was no longer there. Instead, the wall was smooth, unbroken concrete. "That's impossible," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. "It's some kind of prank," Ryan said, though his voice betrayed his fear. "We'll find another way out." As they moved deeper into the shelter, the air grew colder, and the walls began to glisten with a dark, oily substance. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the space around them was growing larger, expanding into something far more sinister. "Stop," Claire said suddenly, shining her flashlight ahead. The beam of light revealed a figure standing in the distance. A tall, gaunt man with empty, hollow eyes and a twisted smile. His body seemed to shimmer, flickering in and out of focus like a badly tuned signal. "Who are you?" Ryan demanded, stepping in front of the group. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening. "I'm what's left of those who came before you." The group backed away, but the figure didn't move. Instead, the walls began to vibrate, the tapping sound returning, louder and faster, until it felt like it was coming from inside their skulls. Then the lights went out completely. In the pitch-black darkness, Emily screamed, and the sound was abruptly cut off. The others frantically called her name, but there was no response. One by one, they began to vanish. Claire was the next to go, her flashlight clattering to the ground as a guttural growl echoed around them. Ryan grabbed her hand, only to find it icy cold, and when he turned the flashlight on her, she was staring blankly ahead, her eyes completely black. "Claire!" he shouted, shaking her, but she didn't respond. Instead, she smiled, an unnaturally wide, chilling grin, before dissolving into the shadows. Now it was just Ryan, alone. The tapping stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing, growing louder and closer. Ryan's flashlight flickered, and in the dim light, he saw them. Figures crawling out from the walls, their faces twisted and inhuman, their limbs contorted at impossible angles. "You can't leave," they whispered in unison, their voices echoing like a chant. "This is our place now, and you're one of us," Ryan screamed, his voice lost in the cacophony of whispers and growls. The light from his flashlight went out for the last time, leaving him in total darkness. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and the townspeople found the storm shelter wide open. But there was no sign of the teenagers. Inside, the walls were covered in scratches, and the words, "They belong to us," were etched into the concrete in jagged, uneven letters. From that day on, the storm shelter was sealed permanently. But during every thunderstorm, those brave or foolish enough to walk near it swore they could hear the tapping and faint whispers from below, calling out for someone new to join them.